All right. Thanking God again for his candor. Now, let me pause. Thanking and praising God again for his candor, even though it can be kind of tough to hear. Let's call chapter 7 of Zechariah cheese, a word that does not come up in the chapter, but why I want to call it cheese, hopefully will become clear before long. God willing, inside of 5 minutes. We'll see. Anyway, the chapter starts out with a question from the people of Bethel in the first 3 chapters, where they're going to ask the Lord, should I weep and abstain in the 5th month as I have done for so many years? Trying to sound like they really about it on that Christianity, I'm going to call it. But in their service to God, we'll say here. Understanding that, God's going to have a very direct answer for them in verses 4 through 7 in the form of 3 questions, where he's going to cut through the pretense and say, was it really for me that you fasted? Was it not for yourselves in the second question? And were not these the words that the Lord proclaimed by the former prophets, as he will go into another word to Zechariah in verses 8 through roughly, let me see, really almost through the end of the chapter that seems to actually break up in a few sections. But in verses 8 through the end of the chapter, he is going to say that he's giving, or it's going to say that he's giving another word of the Lord to Zechariah, but it's going to seem to be a continuation of that third question, where he is going to say, it's the same thing I told you before in verse 9, render true judgments and show kindness and mercy to one another. What we saw back in the famous passage in Micah 6, where he says, what has the Lord asked of you? A passage that he gave to them, as we have mentioned from time to time here, before they went into exile. He's saying the standards haven't changed now that I am trying to reestablish you as a holy people in Jerusalem. But he's going to add to it, say, do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart. Going back even further to the actual law that he gave them coming out of Egypt, trying to establish them as a nation in the first place. However, he is then going to go to their response, describing it as turning a stubborn shoulder in verse 11 and stopping their ears that they might not hear, referring to something that Jesus is really going to use when he describes the purpose of parables in chapter 13. Verse 12 here is going to say, they made their hearts diamond hard, lest they should hear. And so when Jesus is asked the purpose of parables, he is going to refer to Isaiah's prophecy when Isaiah's commission was not really to any longer try to preach to persuade, but it was to preach to further harden the hearts so that their eyes would not see and their ears would not hear, as we say from time to time here, understanding that the heart can be kind of a valve on either allowing information into the mind or rejecting it. And that seems to be what he is saying here in verse 12, where he says they made their hearts diamond hard, lest they should hear. Using an illustration once again that Christ will draw on as well in his ministry, explaining why he began to talk to them in stories as opposed to direct truth. Understanding that their response to the truth that he started out with was a lot like what we see here. Understanding that God is going to say, therefore, because they turned their hearts off so that they would not hear, he's going to say, therefore, he grew angry, and because they refused to hear when he tried to speak to them, he refused to hear when they needed help. Therefore, he allowed them to be scattered and taken off, leaving the land desolate. Verse 14, ending up and saying, then the pleasant land was made desolate. This chapter reminding me, for whatever reason, that if I slap a slice of cheese on my phone, that don't make it a hamburger. And even though that sounds like a super cheesy illustration, that reminds me of what God is really going at here when they come to him acting super holy, like they're fasting for all these years, is this deep level of service to God, when in reality, he's talking about how in each and every one of those years where they went on fasting, they were spending most of their days ignoring the basic things that God was calling them to do. One of those things, verse 10 reminds us, was simply a call to stop being underhanded and shady. And so slapping a slice or a season of fasting on top of habits that were consistently underhanded and shady seemed about as odd as my illustration of slapping a slice of cheese on my phone trying to make it a hamburger. And likewise, even today, as odd as that illustration might sound, what still seems even more odd is the degree to which I more and more seem to see believers slapping a slice of Christianity on top of deeds that are just flat out underhanded or shady. And maybe even worse, slapping a slice of Christianity on top of a pile of excuses for underhanded and shady ways.